I'm a 35-year-old mechanic, and after a long week of diagnosing engines, fixing transmissions, and dealing with customer complaints, I enjoy wandering through other people's cast-offs. I love coming across things that seem to carry their own little tale, something you can breathe new life into. Last month on a Saturday morning, I was driving through a nearby neighborhood when I spotted a sign for a yard sale. It was one of those last-minute detours where you don't expect to find much, but end up stopping anyway. The house was modest, with a folding table on the driveway and a few random items scattered around: books, kitchen gadgets, and a collection of tools that immediately caught my eye. Among the tools was a rusty old metal tool chest. It reminded me of the one my grandfather used to have in his garage when I was a kid. I could almost smell the motor oil and sawdust just looking at it. I opened it up and saw a few random tools inside: a couple of wrenches, some screwdrivers, and an old hammer with a worn wooden handle. Nothing fancy, but it felt like a little piece of nostalgia. "How much for this?" I asked the man running the sale, holding up the tool chest. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. $10, he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Deal," I said, handing over the cash. We chatted for a minute or two about tools and how they don't make them like they used to. Then I carried the tool chest to my car and headed home, happy with my find. A week later, I'd almost forgotten about the chest. It was sitting in my garage, waiting for me to clean it up and maybe use it to organize some of my tools. One evening, as I was finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I wiped my hands on a towel and headed to the door. Standing on my porch was a man I didn't recognize. He was probably in his late 40s, with a wiry build, short brown hair, and a face that looked like it had seen its fair share of trouble. He wasn't threatening exactly, but something about his presence felt oppressive. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping the door only half open. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You bought a tool chest at a yard sale last week, right?" I stared for a moment, surprised. "Oh yeah, why?" "It's mine," he said, leaning slightly closer. "It got sold by mistake. I need it back now." This didn't sit right with me. The man at the yard sale hadn't mentioned anything about it belonging to someone else, and even if it had been a mistake, I'd paid for it fair and square. Still, I tried to be polite. "I'm sorry, but I bought it from the owner." "Are you sure it's the same one?" "It's the same one," he insisted. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just need my tool chest back." I held back for a second, sure there was more to it than he let on. "I'm sorry," I said again, firmer this time. "I bought it legally. If there's an issue, maybe you should talk to the guy who sold it." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "All right," he said, turning to leave, "but I'll be back." True to his word, he came back 2 days later. I was watching TV when the doorbell rang again. This time I didn't answer right away. I peeked through the peephole and saw him standing there looking more agitated than before. "Hey," he shouted, knocking harder. "I know you're in there. Just give me the tool chest and I'll leave you alone." I didn't respond. Something about his tone made me feel uneasy, like he wasn't just some guy looking to reclaim his property. After a few minutes, he gave up and left, but not before pacing back and forth on my porch like a caged animal. The visits continued over the next few days, each one more intense than the last. He'd show up at random times, early in the morning, late at night, and pound on the door yelling about the tool chest. Once I heard him try the doorknob and my stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't locked it. I quickly bolted it and called a friend. "Dude, this guy's unhinged," my friend said. "You need to call the cops." I was hesitant. He hadn't technically done anything illegal yet, and I didn't want to escalate the situation. But when he came back a week later and tried to force his way inside, I knew I couldn't just let it go. I needed to deal with it. It was late around 10 p.m., and I was in the kitchen cleaning up when I heard the pounding on the door. This time it wasn't just knocking. It was the sound of someone trying to shove the door open. "Open the door," he yelled. "I know you're in there." My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the operator, I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands shaking. "I'm calling the police," I shouted through the door. "You need to leave." For a moment there was silence. Then I heard him mutter something under his breath before retreating. I stayed on the line with the operator until the police arrived, explaining everything to the officer who came to my door. "Do you know this guy?" the officer asked. "No," I said, "but he's been coming around for the past week saying the tool chest I bought belongs to him." The officer nodded. We'll file a report and keep an eye out. If he comes back, don't hesitate to call us." That night, I kept thinking about the tool chest, wondering why it was so important to him. Was it sentimental? Did it have something hidden inside? I went to the garage and opened it up, sifting through the tools one by one. Nothing seemed unusual, just the same old wrenches and screwdrivers I'd seen when I bought it. But then I noticed something odd. The bottom of the chest had a false panel. I pried it open with a screwdriver. I was stunned, breathless by what was hidden underneath. Inside were several small plastic bags filled with what looked like white powder. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. Drugs. The man hadn't been after the tool chest, he'd been after his stash. The next morning I took the tool chest straight to the police station and explained everything. The officer I spoke to seemed unsurprised, nodding grimly as he took my statement. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll look into it, but I'd recommend being extra cautious for the next few weeks. If this guy knows you have his stash, he might not give up so easily." After leaving the police station, I tried to go about my day. Work, groceries, the usual. Life had to go on. It was late when I returned home. I couldn't stop thinking about all that had happened this past week. The officer I'd spoken with had been straightforward. Turning over the tool chest and its contents was the right move, but the man might not let things go so easily. They promised to investigate, but the officer's parting words stuck with me. "Be cautious." As I pulled into my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The porch light, which I always left on, was off, leaving the front of my house in eerie darkness. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, scanning the area. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open, the lock shattered and hanging loosely from the frame. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me as I froze, staring at the gaping doorway. For a moment I debated calling the police again, but the urge to know what was happening in my own home was stronger. I dialed 911, keeping the operator on the line, and cautiously stepped inside. The scene was chaos. The living room looked like a tornado had blown through it. Cushions thrown from the couch shelves emptied, and papers scattered everywhere. My heart pounded as I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was no better. Every cabinet door hung open, dishes smashed on the floor, and even the contents of the fridge had been dumped onto the counter. As I turned down the hallway toward the bedrooms, I heard the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen. The back door slammed, and I caught a glimpse of two men sprinting into the backyard, disappearing into the shadows beyond my fence. I wanted to chase them to yell to do something, but fear rooted me to the spot. Instantly, I waited a moment, making sure they were truly gone before continuing to survey the damage. My bedroom was completely trashed. Closets yanked open, the mattress overturned, and every drawer pulled from the dresser and dumped onto the floor. It didn't take a detective to figure out what they'd been after: the tool chest. The police had it now safely tucked away in an evidence locker, but those men didn't know that. They'd been watching me, waiting for me to leave so they could break in and retrieve it themselves. The realization sent a chill down my spine. These men weren't just petty thieves. They were desperate, willing to tear apart my house and risk getting caught to get their hands on their stash. And now they knew it was gone. The police arrived a short time later. I explained what had happened, describing the two men as best I could, though I hadn't seen their faces clearly in the dark. The officers took a report, checked the house, and assured me they'd increase patrols in the area. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm. "It's possible," one of the officers admitted. "But now that they know the tool chest isn't here, they might move on. Either way, we'll keep an eye out. Make sure to install new locks and consider adding some cameras." The next few days I had the locks replaced, installed a security system, and stayed with a friend while I tried to process everything. The sense of violation was overwhelming. My home, my safe space had been invaded, and it was hard to shake the feeling that someone was still watching. I still find myself looking over my shoulder every time I come home, scanning for unfamiliar cars or figures lingering nearby. The police haven't updated me on their investigation, and I don't know if they ever caught the man from the yard sale or his accomplices. Thankfully, the man never came back. I don't know if the police caught him or if he decided the risk wasn't worth it. Either way, I was stuck in a constant state of paranoia, always checking behind me when I was outside. Looking back, I realized how naive I was to think a yard sale could be so harmless. What started as a nostalgic purchase turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. A few years ago, I moved into a quiet neighborhood for work and rented a small house by myself. The street was lined with older homes, and though I hadn't met any of my neighbors yet, everything seemed peaceful at first. That peace didn't last long. One Friday afternoon, a few weeks after I settled in, I noticed a yard sale across the street, one house to the left of mine. The warm weather brought out a few other bargain hunters, so I decided to check it out. The house belonged to an older woman named Ruth, who was warm and welcoming. As I browsed through the collection of vintage trinkets, books, and furniture, I caught something strange out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, at the house directly facing mine, a man was standing at a window, staring at me. His gaze was unnerving, but I quickly looked away, chalking it up to curiosity. Minutes later, I glanced over again. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, staring, his expression blank. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on Ruth's sale. I found a vintage lamp and a small plant stand, paid for them, and told Ruth I had just moved into the neighborhood. She welcomed me warmly, and I started to feel a bit more at ease. As I walked back to my house, I noticed the man again. This time he was at a different window, his unblinking eyes fixed on me. My discomfort deepened, but I told myself not to overreact. Maybe he was just eccentric. That evening, as I sat by the window with a book, I saw the man again, outside in his yard. He wasn't doing anything, just pacing back and forth, occasionally glancing over at my house. My stomach tightened, but I decided to ignore it and went to bed, trying to push the eerie feeling out of my mind. At around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by a loud knocking at my front door. My heart raced as I sat up, unsure if I had imagined it. Then came another knock, louder this time. I crept to a window and peeked out. My blood ran cold. It was him, the man from across the street. He stood there in the dim porch light, his face unreadable. I had no idea why he was there, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed silent, hoping he'd leave. After a few tense minutes, he turned and walked back across the street to his house. I barely slept for the rest of the night, every little noise setting me on edge. The next day, I returned to Ruth's yard sale, needing a distraction and some answers. I asked her casually about the man across the street. Her face darkened, and she hesitated before telling me he had a troubled past and a criminal record. She didn't elaborate, but her tone said enough. My unease turned into outright fear. For a few days, the man seemed to disappear. I didn't see him at his window or outside, and I started to hope the incident had been a fluke. But that hope was shattered a week later. Once again, I woke to knocking at my door, louder, more insistent this time. My pulse raced as I crept to the window. It was him. He stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the door as he knocked again. This time, he didn't walk away after a few minutes. Instead, he turned toward one of the windows and tried to peer inside. My breath caught as I ducked out of sight. He moved from window to window, his face inches from the glass. I could hear his slow footsteps on the gravel outside. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering to avoid alerting him. As I waited, I watched him through a crack in the curtains. He wandered around the side of the house, disappearing from view. My imagination ran wild, wondering if he was trying to find a way inside. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights illuminating the street. They found him in my next-door neighbor's yard. When questioned, he claimed he was looking for a friend's house and had the wrong address. It was a weak excuse, especially since he lived directly across the street. The officers escorted him back to his house, warning him to stay away. Though I felt some relief, I couldn't shake the fear that he'd try something again. For the next month, I kept my doors and windows locked at all times, jumping at every noise. Then one day I noticed his house was empty. A moving truck had come and gone, and he was nowhere to be seen. I never found out why he left or where he went, but I didn't care. I was just relieved he was gone. Even now, I sometimes wonder what his intentions were during those nights. Was he just watching, or was he waiting for the right moment to do something worse? I'll never know, but I'm grateful nothing more happened. That experience taught me to always trust my instincts and stay alert, even in the most seemingly peaceful places. When I was around 6 years old, I used to love going to yard sales with my parents. My mom was great at finding bargains, and I always gravitated toward the toys and kids stuff. One time, I even found an awesome remote-controlled monster truck for just $4, which felt like hitting the jackpot. But that's a story for another day. One sunny Saturday, my mom, sister, and I went to a busy yard sale. There were lots of people milling around and even more stuff spread out across the driveway and lawn. While my mom and sister were looking at clothes and kitchen gadgets, I wandered off to explore. Halfway down the driveway, I found a box full of video games and started rummaging through it, hoping to uncover a treasure. As I was flipping through the games, a woman walked up to me. I looked up, and for some reason, I assumed she was running the sale. She greeted me with a friendly smile and asked what I was looking at. I told her about the games, and she said something that caught my attention. There was a free bin at the end of the driveway. A lot of yard sales had free bins with random trinkets, old Happy Meal toys, or stuff people just wanted to get rid of. The idea of picking something for free was exciting, so when the lady offered to show me, I followed her. At the end of the driveway, she pointed to a box. It wasn't a bad haul for a free pile. There were little toys, books, and even a few board game pieces. She encouraged me to choose something. As I sifted through the box, she stood nearby, occasionally suggesting items she thought I might like. After a couple of minutes, I picked out a small action figure that reminded me of one I'd lost at school. I told her I'd take it, and she smiled, but then things got a little strange. She told me I needed to take the action figure to the car. I don't recall her giving a clear reason why, but she was so casual about it that I didn't question her. I still thought she owned the yard sale, so I followed her instructions without much thought. The car was parked down the street, not too far away, in a quiet residential area. There were a few other cars parked nearby because of the sale, so nothing seemed odd at first. As I started walking toward the car, the lady reached out and took my hand. At the time, I figured she was being overly cautious about crossing the street, but it felt off. I was old enough to cross a quiet street on my own, and her grip felt too firm. Just as we reached the middle of the street, I heard my mom shouting. I turned to see her waving frantically from the driveway, her face full of panic. Another woman, who I later learned was the actual person running the sale, was standing halfway down the driveway, also yelling for me to come back. For a moment I froze. The lady holding my hand suddenly let go, almost as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. Without saying a word, she turned and hurried to a car parked nearby. I stood there, watching as she climbed into the passenger seat. The car's engine was already running, and I noticed a man in the driver's seat. They sped off quickly, leaving me standing there in shock. When I got back to the driveway, my mom and the other woman bombarded me with questions. I explained what had happened, and they filled in the gaps. The woman wasn't part of the yard sale at all. The lady running the sale had seen me with her and thought something was off, especially when she noticed the woman leading me toward the street. She asked my mom if the woman was a friend, and when my mom realized I was gone, they both started shouting. Looking back, it's terrifying to think about what could have happened. I didn't think twice about following her because I thought she was part of the sale. My mom was busy with my 5-year-old sister, who was much more of a handful than I was, so it made sense why she didn't notice me wandering off right away. After that incident, my parents didn't let me out of their sight for a long time. Yard sales, once my favorite weekend activity, felt different after that day. Even now, I feel lucky that my mom and the other woman noticed something was wrong and acted quickly. Who knows what might have happened if they hadn't? It's a scary memory that still sticks with me, but I'm grateful it ended the way it did. Last year, I had a wild and unsettling encounter that didn't seem too terrifying at the moment, but became more unnerving as I thought about it later. My wife and I love garage sales, always on the hunt for unique items at great prices. I pride myself on being a bargain hunter. Once, I snagged a beautiful set of left-handed golf clubs for just $30 because the seller couldn't golf anymore due to surgery. On a sunny summer day, we stumbled upon what looked like an estate sale at a big house in our neighborhood. There was a ton of stuff for sale, so we decided to check it out. The couple running the sale seemed to be in their mid-30s. I struck up a conversation with the guy, and he explained that it wasn't technically an estate sale. The house belonged to his father, who was sitting in a chair near the garage. The man told us his father was dealing with mental decline and would be moving in with him. They planned to renovate the house and rent it out, so they were selling off most of the belongings. A lot of what was in the garage looked like junk, decades of clutter you'd expect from an older person. Then something caught my eye, a vintage wooden cuckoo clock. It was intricately carved with forest scenes, tiny animals, and a working pendulum. It looked antique and in excellent condition. I asked the guy if it was for sale. He shrugged and said, "Sure, $25. I handed him $30, told him to keep the change, and walked off with my new treasure. As we headed to the car, I glanced back and noticed the old man standing now, looking distressed and visibly upset. He appeared to be arguing with his son. I was curious but didn't think much of it and drove home. That evening, we were grilling steaks in the backyard, joined by a couple of neighbors. I told them about the clock, and before long, I went inside to grab it and show it off. It was a hit. Everyone admired its craftsmanship. The evening continued peacefully, with laughter and good food. Around 8 p.m., one of my friends mentioned hearing a knock at the front door. I dismissed it, thinking there was no way we'd hear a knock from the backyard. Just minutes later, my wife let out a blood-curdling scream. We turned to see the old man from the garage sale storming into our backyard. He wasn't slow or frail. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the table where the clock was sitting. I approached him cautiously, trying to calm him down, but he was yelling incoherently. I tried stealing his clock, but he wouldn't. Before I could say much, he raised the clock as if to swing it at me. Thankfully, he wasn't very strong, and I dodged the blow. His anger was so intense it felt like he wasn't fully in control. At that point, I had no choice but to tackle him gently to the ground, worried I might hurt him. My wife called the police while I held him down. When they arrived, the man started yelling about how I had stolen the clock from him. I calmly explained that I bought it at a garage sale and told them to contact his son for verification. After some time, the son arrived, looking mortified. He apologized profusely, explaining that his father had moments of severe confusion and likely thought the clock was still his. I didn't press charges. It was clear the old man wasn't mentally well. But the scariest moment came while I was talking with the son and the officer. My wife suddenly shouted that the old man had snuck over and grabbed the clock again. This time, the officer quickly intervened before anything happened. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if my wife hadn't noticed him pick up the clock. Would he have tried to use it as a weapon again? The son and I exchanged numbers in case anything else came up. And after that incident, I became much more cautious about securing our home. I still have the clock, though my conscience sometimes nags at me. In hindsight, I probably should have given it back to avoid further conflict, but at the time, I wasn't thinking clearly. To this day, I haven't seen that old man again, and I can only hope he's receiving the care he needs. That evening taught me how quickly an innocent situation can take a dark turn.